In the year 450, a shadow descended over Europe. Armies crumbled before a single name. Cities surrendered without a fight. One man, faster than messengers, deadlier than any weapon, showed the world that fear could conquer empires. This is the story of Attila the Hun, the unstoppable force who terrified all of Europe. What he did next would change history forever. At the edge of the Roman world, where maps faded into rumor, a pact was signed in fear. The Eastern Roman Empire, wealthy, ancient, and armed with legions, agreed to pay tribute, not to another emperor, not to a rival king, but to a man from the grasslands beyond the Danube. A man whose people did not build cities, who left no monuments, who ruled from horseback. His name was Attila. By every known rule of civilization, this should not have happened. Rome negotiated with equals or crushed enemies. Yet here, gold flowed outward from Constantinople, hauled north in wagons, surrendered without a battle. The message was unmistakable. Resistance was already considered pointless. This is where the terror begins. Because Attila had not yet marched, to understand how one leader could paralyze Europe with his reputation alone, we must return to a world already cracking under its own weight. The Roman Empire still stood. Its walls were high, its bureaucracy vast, its history unmatched. But beneath the marble and ceremony, something had gone wrong. Armies were expensive, borders were porous, loyalty was purchased, not inspired. And beyond those borders, new forces were gathering, faster, hungrier, and unburdened by Rome's rules. Among them were the Huns. They came from the Eurasian steppe, a landscape that punished weakness and rewarded speed. They did not fight like Rome's enemies of old. There were no set-piece battles, no formal declarations. The Huns appeared suddenly, struck violently, and vanished before legions could respond. Their weapon was not just the bow, it was uncertainty. Roman chroniclers struggled even to describe them. They called them inhuman, monster-like, born in the saddle. These descriptions reveal less about the Huns and more about Rome's fear. Into this world, Attila was born. The exact year is uncertain. Even his childhood is obscured by silence. But what is clear is this: Attila grew up inside a system that forged killers early. Life among the Huns was brutal, mobile, and unforgiving. Survival depended on endurance, authority depended on strength, and mercy was a liability. By the time Attila reached adulthood, the Huns were no longer raiders on Rome's fringe. They were power brokers. Their leader was Rua, Attila's uncle, a man who understood Rome's weakness better than most Roman generals. Rua did not seek conquest yet. He sought leverage, hostages, treaties, gold. He forced the empire into agreements that acknowledged a terrifying truth. Rome could not defeat the Huns in open war. Attila watched all of this. He learned that fear could be harvested, that Rome preferred negotiation to annihilation, that gold moved faster than legions, and that the empire's greatest weakness was not military, it was psychological. Then in 434 CE, Rua died. Power did not pass smoothly. It never does among steppe rulers. Attila did not inherit the throne alone. He shared it with his brother Bleda, two brothers, one empire of riders, one uneasy balance. By every known rule of governance, this should have ended in immediate civil war. It did not at first. Together, Attila and Bleda renewed Rome's submission. The Eastern Empire agreed to double its annual tribute. Roman envoys crossed the Danube under armed escort, bringing gold, silks, and hostages. The message spread rapidly through frontier towns. The Huns were no longer a threat. They were a certainty. Yet even now, Europe underestimated Attila. Roman officials believed they could manage him, divide the brothers, delay payments, play for time. They had done it before with barbarian kings. This was standard imperial policy. No rational administrator expected catastrophe. History insists this should have worked. But Attila was not like the others. Behind the diplomacy, he studied Roman habits. He learned their roots, their defenses, their delays. He understood that Rome's strength lay in preparation, and that preparation was slow. Then came the first test. When Roman merchants violated Hun territory, illegally trading, spying, provoking, Attila demanded punishment. Rome hesitated. Bureaucrats debated. Governors stalled. No rational commander would escalate over traders. Attila did. Hun forces surged south. Forts along the Danube were erased with terrifying speed. Garrisons were slaughtered. Towns emptied overnight, not from evacuation orders but from rumor. Entire populations fled before the Huns arrived, convinced survival was impossible. And still, this was not the main attack. It was a message. Rome scrambled to respond. Payments were resumed. Apologies issued. Envoys bowed deeply. The empire survived for now. But inside the Hun leadership, the balance between the brothers was collapsing. Attila was patient. Bleda was not. By 445 CE, Bleda was dead, killed during a hunting expedition, according to official accounts. No witnesses, no trial, no mourning. Attila became sole ruler of the Huns. By every known rule of steppe politics, this should have unleashed chaos. Rivals should have risen. Clans should have splintered. Rebellions should have followed. None came. Instead, something unprecedented happened. The Huns unified. Warriors from across the steppe gathered under Attila's command, not because of tradition but because of results. He rewarded loyalty with plunder. He punished defiance with extinction. His authority was absolute, his discipline ruthless, and now there was no brother to restrain him. Across Europe, rulers felt the shift before they understood it. Diplomatic demands grew harsher. Tribute increased. Deadlines shortened. Every delay was met with violence. Attila was no longer negotiating to coexist. He was preparing to advance. The Roman world, still rich, still proud, believed it could absorb another crisis. It always had. By every historical precedent, this was manageable. But this time, the threat was not a migrating tribe or a rival empire. It was a man who had learned Rome's fear and decided to use it, and the real war had not yet begun. Year 447 CE. The earth itself broke before Attila arrived. In January, a violent earthquake ripped through the Eastern Roman Empire. Walls collapsed, towers crumbled, cities that had stood for centuries were suddenly exposed. Constantinople survived, but barely. Across the Balkans, fortresses along the Danube frontier lay shattered, their stones scattered like bones. By every known rule of fate, this should have been a temporary disaster, something Rome could repair with time and money. Attila allowed them neither. The Hunnic army moved as winter loosened its grip, not marching in columns, not burdened by supply trains, but flowing thousands of riders spreading across the plains, their approach silent until it was too late. Roman commanders faced an impossible calculation. Their defenses were ruined, their troops scattered, and their emperor Theodosius II still believed diplomacy could buy survival. Attila had other plans. He crossed the Danube not as a raider, but as an executioner. City after city fell, not through heroic last stands, but through terror. Garrisons fled before contact. Civilians abandoned homes with food still cooking. Churches filled with refugees, only to become mass graves when walls failed. Roman sources speak of 70 cities destroyed. The number is likely exaggerated, but the devastation was real. Fields burned, roads vanished under ash and blood. Entire regions ceased to function. History insists resistance should have slowed him. It did not. Attila's genius was not brute force, it was momentum. He never allowed Rome time to regroup. Every delay was punished, every negotiation exploited. When Roman envoys arrived begging for terms, they found a ruler unmoved by titles, unimpressed by threats. He demanded gold, more than ever before. Theodosius agreed. By every known rule of imperial dignity, this should have been the moment Rome reasserted itself. Instead, the empire signed the Treaty of Anatolius, a document of humiliation. The tribute was tripled. A massive one-time payment was added. Large sections of the Balkans were declared uninhabitable buffer zones, surrendered to Attila outright. Rome paid not for peace but for breathing space, and even that came at a cost no one had calculated. Inside Constantinople, the strain was unbearable. Gold reserves drained. Taxes skyrocketed. Farmers fled land they could no longer protect. Soldiers questioned why they bled while emperors negotiated. The Roman world was not just losing territory, it was losing faith, and Attila knew it. But conquest alone was not enough, because power invites paranoia. Attila understood that Rome, humiliated and desperate, would seek another solution, not on the battlefield but in shadows. He was right. In 449 CE, a plot reached him. Roman officials had secretly arranged for Attila's assassination. Bribes were offered to Hunnic retainers, poison prepared. The empire hoped to remove the problem quietly, restore order without war. By every known rule of espionage, this should have remained hidden. It did not. Attila exposed the conspiracy publicly. Roman envoys were confronted, confessions extracted, evidence displayed. He did not kill them. Instead, he sent them back alive with a message. Rome was no longer just weak, it was contemptible. From that moment, Attila's demands escalated beyond logic. Tribute was no longer enough. Submission was no longer sufficient. He wanted recognition, not as a barbarian king, but as an equal to emperors. And now his gaze began to shift west. The Western Roman Empire was in worse condition than the East. Its treasury was empty, its armies filled with mercenaries. Its Emperor Valentinian III was young, indecisive, and surrounded by rival factions. By every rational assessment, the West should have been Attila's first target. It was not, because Attila waited. He watched Rome weaken itself. The Western Empire was tearing apart from within. Generals competed for power. Provinces rebelled. Britain was abandoned. Africa, Rome's breadbasket, was lost to the Vandals. The empire still looked impressive on maps. In reality, it was hollow. Attila understood something Rome had forgotten. Timing is everything. Then came the spark. In 450 CE, a letter arrived at Attila's court. It bore the seal of Honoria, sister of Emperor Valentinian III. Desperate to escape an unwanted marriage, and desperate for power, she had sent Attila her ring, along with a message that could be interpreted as a proposal. Attila chose to interpret it that way. By every known rule of diplomacy, this should have been dismissed as scandal. Attila saw opportunity. He declared Honoria his bride, and demanded half the Western Roman Empire as her dowry. The Western court panicked. Valentinian refused. He claimed misunderstanding. He insulted Attila's claim. This was the mistake, because now Attila had something Rome could not counter, a justification. He was no longer attacking as a conqueror. He was coming as a wronged husband. Across Europe, rumors exploded. Kings and generals realized what was coming. The Hunnic war machine, hardened in the Balkans, enriched by Roman gold, unified under a single will, was turning west. Gaul lay in its path. No rational commander believed it could be stopped. The Western Empire scrambled to respond. Its greatest general, Flavius Aetius, understood the scale of the disaster. He had once lived among the Huns as a hostage. He knew their methods, their speed, their cruelty, and he knew something worse. Attila was no longer fighting for tribute. He was fighting for legacy. As the Huns began to move, smoke rose over frontier towns. Refugees flooded Roman roads. Old alliances were tested. Ancient enemies were courted as last hopes. History insists this should have ended with Rome's collapse. And as Attila advanced toward Gaul, the fate of Western civilization balanced on a single decision yet to be made. The West finally understood what the East had learned too late. Attila was no longer probing. He was advancing with purpose. From the Rhine frontier, the Hunnic host poured into Gaul. This was not a single army, but a moving system of destruction. Huns rode at the center, fast and merciless. Around them marched subject peoples forced into service. Gepids, Ostrogoths, Scyrri, men who fought because refusal meant death. The army fed on conquest. Cities supplied it or vanished. By every known rule of warfare, this invasion should have shattered instantly. Gaul was fragmented. Roman authority was thin. Garrisons were weak. Roads were clogged with refugees who slowed any response. Attila exploited all of it. Towns fell without resistance. Metz burned. Reims was devastated. Paris prepared for annihilation. Its people convinced the end had come. Chroniclers describe panic so complete that prayer replaced planning. Survival itself felt absurd. Yet Attila did not slow, because speed was the weapon. He moved faster than messengers, faster than councils could meet, faster than armies could assemble. Every delay Rome suffered multiplied his advantage. History insists this should have ended here. But one man refused to accept inevitability. His name was Flavius Attius. Attius had spent years among the Huns in his youth, a political hostage learning their language, their habits, their strengths. He understood what Roman generals did not. You could not defeat Attila with legions alone. You could only survive him by denying him isolation. Attius made a decision no Roman commander should have made. He began begging. Not provinces, not troops. He begged enemies, Visigoths, long-time rivals settled uneasily in Gaul. Franks, divided and unreliable. Burgundians, traumatized survivors of earlier Hunnic destruction. Even Alans, mistrusted and strategically exposed. By every rule of imperial pride, this coalition was madness. These peoples had fought Rome for generations. Many still hated it. But Attila terrified them more. One by one they agreed, not out of loyalty to Rome, but out of fear of extinction. For the first time in decades, the Western Roman Empire did not stand alone. It stood at the center of a fragile alliance, held together by terror and desperation. And even then, it was not enough. Attila reached the city of Aurelianum, modern Orléans, before the coalition was ready. The city's walls held, but only just. Hunnic siege engines battered defenses while defenders exhausted themselves in constant combat. Every hour mattered. If Orléans fell, the road into the heart of Gaul would open. The alliance would disintegrate before it fully formed. Attila pressed the attack. No rational commander would linger here. Delay risked encirclement. Delay allowed enemies to gather. Attila stayed, because he believed no force on earth could stop him. At the last possible moment, Attila arrived with the coalition army. Banners appeared on the horizon. Horns sounded. Attila withdrew, not in panic, but with calculation. He retreated to open ground, better suited to his cavalry. This was not defeat, it was positioning. Both sides understood what was coming. The confrontation would decide the fate of the West. They met on the Catalonian plains. The exact location is debated, but the reality is not. This was one of the largest battles ever fought on European soil. Tens of thousands faced each other. Cavalry, infantry, allied contingents with different languages and loyalties, all bound by a single understanding. If they broke, Europe would break with them. Attila positioned himself carefully. He placed his Huns at the center, where their mobility could be decisive. His subject peoples formed the wings, less trusted, more expendable. Across the field, Attius did something extraordinary. He did not put Romans at the center. He placed the Visigoths there, under their king Theodoric I. By every known rule of command, this was reckless. The Visigoths were proud, aggressive, and not fully controllable. Giving them the center meant giving them the battle's fate. Attius did it anyway, because he understood psychology. The Visigoths had the most to lose. They were settled. They had families. Attila offered them only annihilation. If they held, others would follow. The battle erupted with ferocity unmatched in living memory. Arrows darkened the sky. Cavalry slammed into infantry. Men fought not for orders but for survival. Theodoric was killed in the chaos, trampled beneath horses. News of his death should have broken the Visigoths. It did the opposite. Rage replaced fear. They surged forward with renewed violence, driving Attila's forces back. For the first time in his career, Attila's momentum faltered. History insists this was his defeat. It was not. As night fell, the battlefield became a killing ground of confusion. Corpses lay so thick that movement was difficult. Neither side could claim total victory. Both were shattered. Attila withdrew to his camp and did something no one expected. He prepared for death. He ordered saddles stacked into a funeral pyre. If the enemy broke through, he would burn himself alive rather than be captured. This was not theater. This was belief. Attila did not imagine a world in which he was defeated and lived, but the attack never came. Attila held back. Why remains debated. Fear, exhaustion, political calculation. He may have believed destroying Attila entirely would empower the Visigoths too much. He may have known the coalition would collapse without a common enemy. By every known rule of warfare, this was the moment to finish it. History insists it should have ended here. Instead, Attila escaped. The field was left to the dead. Tens of thousands lay unburied. Europe survived, but barely. The myth of Attila's invincibility was cracked, not destroyed, and cracks can be more dangerous than certainty, because Attila was still alive, and now humiliated, wounded, and furious, he turned his eyes south, toward Italy, toward Rome itself, year 452 CE. The defeat that should have ended Attila only sharpened him. After the carnage in Gaul, the world expected retreat. Armies usually dissolved after such slaughter. Alliances collapsed. Leaders counted losses and rebuilt. Attila did none of this. He did not disband his forces. He did not seek peace. He did not retreat east. He turned south. Italy lay open in a way Gaul never had. The Alps were not an impenetrable wall anymore. Roman garrisons were thin. Cities relied on memory rather than manpower. And worst of all, famine and plague stalked the land ahead of him. By every known rule of war, this was the wrong direction. Italy was poor in supplies, rich in fortifications, and emotionally symbolic. Attacking it invited resistance beyond reason. Attila welcomed that. He crossed the Alps with an army that should not have survived the journey. Horses starved, men froze, supply lines stretched beyond sense. Yet the army moved, driven by fear and obedience rather than comfort. The first city in his path was Aquileia. Aquileia had never fallen. Its walls were strong, its people confident. When Attila arrived, they closed their gates and waited him out. History insists the city should have survived. The siege dragged on for months. Disease spread in Attila's camp. Morale cracked. Supplies ran low. According to later accounts, Attila himself considered abandoning the assault. Then a story spread. A single stork was seen lifting its young from the city walls, flying away. Attila took it as a sign that even nature was abandoning Aquileia. He ordered one final assault. The walls broke. What followed was annihilation. Aquileia was not conquered. It was erased. Survivors fled into marshes that would later become Venice. The city itself disappeared so completely that later generations struggled to locate its ruins. The message was clear: no wall was enough. Northern Italy collapsed in panic. Cities surrendered without resistance. Others emptied before Attila arrived. The Roman administration dissolved. Roads filled with refugees carrying relics, children, fragments of lives abandoned mid-sentence. The Western Emperor, Valentinian III, did nothing. He could do nothing. Aetius, the only man who had stood against Attila, was sidelined by court politics and distrust. The army that had faced the Huns in Gaul no longer existed. Allies had gone home. Treasuries were empty. Rome stood defenseless. Attila advanced toward the Po Valley, leaving a trail of destruction so severe that the region would not recover for generations. Famine followed his path like a shadow. Corpses fouled rivers. Crops burned before harvest. By every known rule of survival, Italy should have fallen completely. Then something extraordinary happened. Attila stopped. Near the river Mincio, an embassy approached his camp. Not soldiers, not generals, priests. At their head was Pope Leo I. No army accompanied him. No threat was made. He carried no gold that could satisfy Attila's demands, only words. What was said between them remains unknown. Chroniclers embroidered the meeting with visions and divine warnings, but history is quieter and more disturbing. Attila listened, and then he withdrew. This moment has haunted historians for centuries. Why would the man who terrified Europe turn back when Rome lay open? There was no single reason. There never is. His army was exhausted. Italy was stripped bare. Disease spread through the ranks. Eastern Roman forces were threatening his homeland. And Attila understood limits. He was brutal, not foolish. This was not mercy. It was calculation. Attila turned east, leaving Italy broken but unconquered. Rome survived again, not through strength but through circumstance. History insists this was Attila's final act. It was not, because the world that had opposed him was already collapsing from within. In 453 CE, at the height of his power, Attila died. The accounts vary. Some say he bled to death on his wedding night. Others suggest assassination. What matters is the result. The man who held the Hunnic Empire together was gone. His sons fought. The subject peoples rebelled. The empire he built shattered within a generation. By every known rule of legacy, this should have reduced Attila to a footnote. It did not. Because Attila did not destroy Rome directly, he did something worse. He exposed it. He revealed that the empire no longer fell because of invasion, but because it could not respond to pressure without breaking itself. After Attila, the Western Roman Empire unraveled rapidly. Within 2 decades, the imperial title vanished. Europe did not remember Attila as a king. They remembered him as a force, the man whose name alone emptied cities, the man who made emperors kneel, the man who came from nowhere, shattered certainty, and vanished before he could be defeated. History insists monsters fade. Attila did not. He became a warning that civilization is fragile, that power rests on belief, and that sometimes all it takes to break the world is one man who refuses to accept its rules. Year 453 CE. The world woke up without Attila and did not know what to do. There was no announcement, no grand collapse, no final battle, just silence spreading outward from the Hunnic heartland, slow and unsettling. For years, Europe had lived in reaction to one man's movement. Now, there was nothing to react to. Attila was dead, not killed in combat, not struck down by an enemy. He died at the height of his power, on a night meant for celebration. Accounts speak of a sudden hemorrhage, blood choking him as he slept beside a new bride. No witnesses, no certainty, only the abrupt end of a force that had bent empires. By every known rule of history, this should have brought relief. Instead, it brought chaos. The Hunnic Empire was not a state. It had no institutions, no bureaucracy, no succession laws that could survive a strong ruler's absence. It was held together by fear, reward, and Attila's will alone. The moment that will vanished, everything loosened. His sons claimed authority. None commanded obedience. Subject peoples who had followed Attila, because defiance meant annihilation, now sensed weakness. Old grudges resurfaced. Old humiliations demanded repayment. What Attila had suppressed with terror erupted the moment that terror was gone. Civil war followed. The Huns fought each other. Allies turned enemies. Camps burned. leaders were assassinated. Within years, the empire that had terrified two Roman worlds fractured beyond repair. History insists this is where Attila's story ends. It is wrong, because the damage he caused did not die with him. Across Europe, the landscape he left behind was transformed. Entire regions were depopulated. Cities once prosperous were reduced to ruins and never rebuilt. Trade routes shattered, authority dissolved. The psychological shock of his invasions lingered long after the hoofprints faded. Rome especially could not recover. The Western Roman Empire had survived Attila, but it had not survived the cost of surviving him. Its treasury was drained, its armies weakened, its political cohesion destroyed by fear and infighting. And then came the final betrayal. In 454 CE, Emperor Valentinian III murdered Flavius Aetius with his own hands. The man who had organized Europe's last defense against Attila was cut down in a palace hall, struck without warning. By every known rule of survival, this was madness. A courtier is said to have warned the emperor that he had cut off his right hand with his left. Within months, Valentinian himself was assassinated. The Western Empire spiraled. Germanic kings ruled Roman lands in all but name. The imperial office became ceremonial, then irrelevant. In 476 CE, a child emperor was deposed. No one replaced him. The Western Roman Empire ended not with a battle, but with a shrug. Attila did not live to see this. He did not need to, because his invasions accelerated processes already underway. He shattered illusions. He forced Rome to expose its weaknesses. He turned fear into a political reality no decree could undo. In the centuries that followed, Attila's name mutated. To Romans, he was the scourge of God. A punishment sent for moral decay, a figure of divine terror. To later Europeans, he became a monster in legend, a barbarian king who delighted in destruction. To the peoples of the steppe, he was remembered differently, as a unifier, a ruler who forged power from nothing but movement and will. The truth is less comforting. Attila was not inevitable. He was possible. He emerged because the world around him was fragile, divided, and convinced of its own permanence. He exploited systems that depended on ritual and delay. He thrived on overconfidence and hesitation. By every known rule of civilization, Rome should have adapted. It did not. Attila exposed a brutal reality. Empires do not fall when they are conquered. They fall when they lose the ability to respond faster than their enemies. After Attila, Europe entered a new age, one of fractured authority, shifting borders, and constant negotiation between violence and survival. The world he left behind was not ruined forever, but it was changed permanently. The old certainty was gone, and this is the final horror of Attila's legacy. He proved that the greatest threat to civilization does not always come from superior numbers or better weapons. Sometimes it comes from a single man who understands fear better than anyone else. A man who appears at the exact moment when resistance feels pointless. A man whose rise feels impossible, and whose absence leaves a world unsure how to breathe again. But Attila's story is not finished, because his legend did not die with him. It traveled forward through centuries of fear, myth and memory, shaping how Europe would understand power, invasion and collapse long after the Huns themselves vanished. And to understand that legacy is to confront an uncomfortable truth, that the world Attila broke was already breaking, and that the next Attila would not need to come from the steppe. Year after 453 CE, Attila was gone, but Europe could not let him die. Long after his body was buried in secrecy, his name continued to move armies. Chroniclers wrote in fear. Priests preached him as punishment. Kings warned their children with stories of what happened when borders failed. This was not memory, it was trauma. The Hunnic Empire dissolved quickly, but the void it left behind was dangerous. Power does not vanish, it migrates. Peoples once crushed under Attila's command now moved freely, carrying weapons, tactics and fear into Roman lands. The Ostrogoths pushed west. The Gepids seized former Hunnic territory. The balance of Europe shifted permanently. Rome had survived the storm, but its foundations were cracked beyond repair. In the decades that followed, the Western Roman world fragmented into successor kingdoms. These rulers borrowed Roman titles, laws and rituals, but they ruled through force rather than institutions. The idea of a single, unchallenged authority in the West was gone. Attila did not cause this transformation alone, he accelerated it. Before Attila, Roman decline could be explained away as temporary weakness. After Attila, denial became impossible. The empire had paid tribute like a vassal. Its cities had emptied in panic. Its survival had depended on luck and diplomacy rather than strength. These memories hardened into legend. By the early Middle Ages, Attila became a symbol rather than a man. In Germanic epics, he appeared as Etzel, a powerful but ominous king. In Christian tradition, he was the scourge of God, an instrument of divine wrath. In Eastern memory, he remained a ruler of almost mythic authority. Each version revealed the same fear. That civilization is not protected by walls or wealth alone. Attila forced Europe to confront something it did not want to admit. The world it had inherited from Rome was not eternal. It could be broken by speed, unity, and ruthless clarity of purpose, and this lesson endured. Centuries later, when new invasions came, chroniclers reached for Attila's name. When the Mongols appeared on Europe's eastern horizon, riders fast and merciless, terrified populations called them new Huns. The comparison was not historical, it was psychological. Attila had become a template for apocalypse. Even modern historians struggle with him. Sources are biased, hostile, exaggerated. Roman writers despised him. They framed him as monstrous to make their own failures easier to bear. And yet, behind the propaganda, a clearer figure emerges. Attila was disciplined. He punished excess. He maintained order in an army of multiple peoples and languages. He preferred intimidation to unnecessary slaughter, but when intimidation failed, he destroyed without hesitation. This combination made him unstoppable. He did not rely on overwhelming numbers. His armies were often outnumbered. He did not rely on superior technology. Rome had better fortifications, better armor, better logistics. By every known rule of war, he should have lost. He did not, because he understood something Rome had forgotten. Fear is faster than force. Attila attacked morale before walls. He struck supply lines before armies. He moved unpredictably, denying enemies the comfort of preparation. He exploited hesitation mercilessly. The Roman system was designed to function in stable conditions. It collapsed under sustained pressure. Attila applied that pressure relentlessly. And then he vanished. This is what makes him so difficult to place in history. He did not build a lasting state. He left no architecture, no legal codes, no cities bearing his name. His empire disappeared almost as quickly as it formed. Yet his impact was permanent. Europe reorganized itself around the trauma of his invasions. Fortifications changed, diplomacy hardened, alliances were built with an understanding that sudden destruction was always possible. Attila taught Europe to expect catastrophe, and in doing so, he reshaped its future. But there is one final irony. Attila is remembered as a destroyer of Rome. In truth, Rome destroyed itself. Attila did not sack the city. He did not depose the last emperor. He did not rule Roman lands. He merely exposed the fragility of systems already decaying. Rome's reliance on tribute, on mercenaries, on delayed responses, on internal rivalries all existed before Attila arrived. He simply pushed them past the point of recovery. This is why his story still matters, not because he was uniquely evil, but because he was uniquely effective at revealing weakness. Attila shows us that history does not always turn on grand ideals or moral struggles. Sometimes it turns on momentum, timing, and the willingness to act when others hesitate. Empires fall not when they face enemies, they fall when they cannot adapt fast enough to confront them. Attila understood this, and that understanding allowed one man from the edge of the known world to terrorize an entire continent, bend emperors to his will, and vanish without ever being truly defeated. His shadow did not remain because of what he built. It remained because of what he proved, that no civilization, no matter how ancient or confident, is immune to collapse, and that the most dangerous leaders are not always those who promise a new world, but those who force the old one to confront its own fragility. This is why Attila the Hun is not just a figure of the past. He is a warning. Long after the fires burned out, history tried to move on, but Attila refused to stay buried. Centuries passed. Kingdoms rose where Roman provinces once stood. New religions reshaped belief. New languages replaced Latin in the streets. Yet when Europeans spoke of ultimate destruction, they reached for the same name, Attila. This persistence is not accidental. Most conquerors fade when their empires fade. Attila did not. His memory survived because it occupied a space deeper than politics. He entered Europe's subconscious as proof that order itself could fail without warning. The world after Rome was obsessed with that fear. Medieval rulers studied collapse as much as conquest. They rebuilt walls higher, they fortified borders earlier, they sought alliances not just for advantage but for survival. Every generation inherited stories of how quickly everything could unravel. Attila became the reference point, not because he was the strongest enemy Rome ever faced, but because he struck at a moment when resistance already felt futile. Europe recognized itself in that weakness, and the recognition was unbearable. This is why Attila's image warped over time. He was exaggerated, demonized, mythologized. Chroniclers added cruelty, monsters, divine omens. These distortions were not ignorance, they were defense mechanisms. If Attila was inhuman, then Rome's failure could be excused. But strip away the legend, and something far more unsettling remains. Attila succeeded because he read systems better than the people inside them. He understood that Rome depended on routine, on predictable campaigning seasons, on written orders. On slow negotiations, he exploited delay like a weapon. He forced reactions instead of allowing plans. When Rome paid tribute, he demanded more. When Rome fortified borders, he bypassed them. When Rome tried diplomacy, he exposed its desperation. At every step, he forced his enemies into worse options. By every known rule of stability, Rome should have adapted. It did not. And this pattern repeats throughout history. Empires rarely fall because of a single invasion. They fall because they respond to pressure using outdated assumptions. They rely on past successes instead of present realities. They underestimate threats that do not look familiar. Attila looked unfamiliar. He had no capital to capture, no bureaucracy to bribe, no senate to intimidate. His power moved with him. This made him impossible to neutralize using traditional tools. Even his death followed this logic. He was not defeated by enemies. He was not overthrown. He simply disappeared, and the system he built disappeared with him. His empire had no inertia without his presence. This too became a lesson. European rulers learned to fear personal rule that depended entirely on one individual. They saw how quickly unity could collapse when authority lacked structure. In this sense, Attila influenced governance as much as warfare, and yet the irony remains. Attila never ruled Europe. He never replaced Rome. He never created a lasting order. His power lay entirely in disruption. This is why modern comparisons to Attila are always warnings, never aspirations. To be called a new Attila is not to be praised. It is to be feared as someone who breaks systems without caring what replaces them. Attila's true legacy is the question he forces us to confront. What happens when institutions grow slower than threats? Rome believed itself eternal because it had always recovered before. Attila arrived when recovery had become illusion. That timing matters more than strength. That confidence can be fatal, and that fear, when used deliberately, can dismantle civilizations faster than armies. The final image of Attila is telling. He dies not on a battlefield, but in silence. His burial is secret, his grave unmarked. No monument claims him, no city bears his name. And yet, he is remembered more vividly than emperors who ruled for decades, because memory does not belong to builders alone. It belongs to those who reveal truth through destruction. Attila revealed that Europe's world was already ending. He did not bring the collapse. He arrived at the moment when collapse could no longer be hidden. This is why his story feels inevitable, why every attempt to stop him came too late, why every rational strategy failed. The world he faced was already tired, already divided, already unsure of itself. Attila did not need to conquer Europe. He only needed to push, and Europe fell inward. This is why Attila the Hun remains one of history's most feared figures, not because of how much land he ruled, but because of how little resistance it took to unbalance everything. And that is the final discomfort his story leaves behind. That our own systems may look strong, that our institutions may feel permanent, that our confidence may feel earned, until the moment someone arrives who understands exactly how fragile they really are. The generations after Rome. Europe rebuilt itself on a dangerous belief. After Attila, rulers convinced themselves the nightmare was over because the man was gone. The Huns had fractured, the roads were quieter, the fires no longer burned on the horizon. For a time, it seemed as if survival itself had proven resilience. It was an illusion. What Attila truly destroyed was not cities or armies, but certainty. The idea that borders could be trusted, that treaties guaranteed time, that power moved slowly enough to be managed. This loss of certainty shaped everything that followed. Kings no longer assumed peace was the natural state. They ruled expecting catastrophe. Castles rose where towns once stood open. Fields were cultivated with escape in mind. Authority became localized, defensive, suspicious. Europe became a continent braced for shock. This transformation is often blamed on chaos or ignorance, but its roots were rational. People remembered how quickly the world had turned hostile, how empires had begged, how gold had failed, how walls had collapsed before preparation was complete. Attila taught them that safety could vanish between seasons, and so politics hardened, trust narrowed. Violence became preventative rather than reactive. This was not regression, it was adaptation born of fear. Yet even as Europe adjusted, it misunderstood the lesson. Many believed the threat had come from the east because Attila came from the steppe. They built defenses facing outward. They fortified frontiers. They prepared for invaders who looked like Huns. But Attila's most devastating weapon was not foreignness, it was speed. The inability of systems to react quickly enough, and that weakness remained. New powers rose in the vacuum left by Rome. Frankish kings, Visigothic rulers, Lombard warlords. They adopted Roman titles and laws, but their authority was personal, fragile, contested. Each realm balanced on loyalty rather than legitimacy. This made them vulnerable in the same way Rome had been, and history would test them again. When later invasions came, the pattern repeated. Surprise, panic, fragmentation. The memory of Attila returned, not as a story, but as a feeling. The sudden understanding that everything could collapse faster than leaders could respond. Attila had rewired Europe's expectations. This is why his name endured in sermons, chronicles, and warnings. Parents told children about him not as history, but as possibility, a reminder that the world could change without permission. Over time, the legend overshadowed the man. He became larger, darker, more monstrous. This exaggeration served a purpose. It placed the threat outside humanity, beyond responsibility, but the reality was more unsettling. Attila was human. He made choices. He exploited systems that others trusted too deeply, and this meant he could happen again. That realization haunted Europe far more than any tale of barbarian cruelty, because monsters can be dismissed, patterns cannot. Attila's rise followed a sequence that would repeat across centuries. A powerful system grows confident. It prioritizes stability over adaptability. It responds to danger slowly, assuming time is on its side. Then a leader emerges who understands urgency, who acts while others debate, who uses fear deliberately, not impulsively, and suddenly history accelerates. This is why Attila remains relevant far beyond his century, not because of the Huns, but because of how power actually breaks. Rome did not fall because it was weaker than Attila. It fell because it was slower, and slowness is invisible until it is fatal. Attila forced Europe to abandon the belief that survival was guaranteed by tradition. After him, rulers understood that legitimacy meant nothing if it could not be defended immediately. This changed leadership itself. Kings traveled constantly. They ruled from horseback and camps, not palaces. They stayed close to their armies. Distance became a liability. Presence became power. In this way, Attila shaped medieval rulership without ever ruling medieval kingdoms. His shadow defined how authority behaved. Even religion absorbed the lesson. Christian thinkers framed history as unstable, shaped by divine intervention and punishment. The idea of inevitable progress disappeared. The future became uncertain, contingent, fragile. Attila fit perfectly into this worldview. He was interpreted as proof that arrogance invited destruction, that moral decay led to collapse. Whether this was true mattered less than the fear it produced. Fear is efficient. Attila understood this instinctively, and this is why his story cannot be reduced to conquest or brutality. It is a study in momentum, in timing, in what happens when belief in stability outpaces reality. The tragedy is that Rome had seen this coming. Its borders had been pressured for centuries, its armies stretched thin, its politics poisoned by rivalry. Attila did not invent these weaknesses. He arrived when they could no longer be hidden. That is why stopping him required impossible unity, and why even then survival came at a cost Rome could not afford. Europe learned from Attila, but it learned the wrong lesson first. It believed strength lay in walls and weapons. Only later did it understand that adaptability mattered more, that systems must change faster than threats, that power is temporary, and that confidence can be fatal. Attila's true victory was not over Rome, it was over the idea that history moves slowly. After him, Europe lived with the awareness that everything could change in a single season. That awareness shaped the world for centuries, and it remains the quiet warning at the heart of his story. The centuries shaped by memory. After Attila, fear stopped being an emotion and became a strategy. Rulers no longer treated terror as a byproduct of war, they treated it as a tool. Attila had demonstrated its efficiency too clearly to ignore. He had achieved with reputation what others failed to do with armies. Cities surrendered before walls were tested. Armies hesitated before swords met. Decisions were made in panic rather than confidence. Europe took note. Kings who followed did not speak openly of Attila, but they imitated him in fragments. Swift raids replaced formal campaigns. Sudden displays of cruelty were used to prevent prolonged resistance. Messages were crafted not just to inform but to intimidate. The lesson was clear. A war won quickly through fear was cheaper than one fought slowly through force. This was not barbarism replacing civilization. It was civilization adapting to trauma. The Roman way of war had emphasized order, hierarchy, and endurance. It assumed time was available. Attila shattered that assumption. After him, time became the most precious resource. Lose it and defeat followed. Medieval warfare reflects this shift. Campaigns became shorter, more violent, more decisive. Castles were built not just as defenses, but as statements. They projected strength to discourage attack. Lords punished rebellion publicly to prevent it spreading. Mercy was calculated. Cruelty was performative. All of this traced back to the realization that hesitation was fatal. Attila had forced Europe to understand that fear could travel faster than messengers. This understanding also reshaped diplomacy. Treaties after Attila were written with suspicion. Guarantees mattered less than leverage. Alliances were formed with escape routes in mind. Trust narrowed to family, then to immediate retainers. The dream of universal order that Rome had once embodied faded completely. In its place emerged a world of constant readiness. Even law absorbed the lesson. Justice became local, swift, and often brutal. Central authority could no longer enforce patience. Delays invited disorder. Decisions were made decisively, sometimes harshly, because delay meant vulnerability. This is why the post-Roman world feels violent to modern eyes. It was not chaos, it was fear institutionalized. Attila had proven that threats did not announce themselves politely. They arrived suddenly, exploited weakness, and disappeared before systems could respond. Survival required acting before certainty, and so certainty was abandoned. But this transformation carried a cost. Fear is efficient, but it is corrosive. It narrows imagination. It encourages short-term survival over long-term stability. It rewards strength over cooperation. The Europe that emerged after Attila was resilient, but brittle. Fragmented power structures limited collapse, but also limited progress. Unity became suspect. Large systems were feared because they were slow. This suspicion shaped Europe for 1,000 years. Empires were rare. Authority was negotiated constantly. Kings ruled by presence, not distance. When rulers grew complacent, they were replaced violently. Attila had not ruled long, but his imprint endured in this instability, and yet fear alone could not sustain civilization. Gradually, Europe relearned balance. Institutions rebuilt cautiously. Laws expanded, trade resumed, but always beneath the surface lay the memory of how quickly it could all unravel. Attila remained the unspoken reference point, the reminder that systems must justify their existence through effectiveness, not tradition. This is why his story is retold in moments of crisis, when borders feel insecure, when institutions feel slow, when leaders feel disconnected from reality. Attila returns as a metaphor, not because he provides solutions, but because he exposes failure. He represents the moment when assumptions collapse, the moment when history accelerates beyond control. This is why Attila unsettles even modern historians. He does not fit neatly into narratives of progress or decline. He did not create a new order. He did not articulate an ideology. He simply moved faster than everyone else at a moment when speed mattered more than vision, and that is deeply uncomfortable, because it suggests that history is not always guided by ideas or values. Sometimes it is guided by urgency, by who reacts first, by who understands fear before others do. Attila was not unique because of his brutality. Brutality was common. He was unique because he recognized that Rome's greatest vulnerability was its belief in continuity. Rome believed tomorrow would resemble yesterday closely enough to plan for it. Attila ensured it did not. After him, Europe learned to expect disruption. That expectation reshaped leadership, warfare, law, and memory itself. Even today, when people speak of systems collapsing suddenly, they invoke language born in that era: floods, invasions, storms, forces that arrive too quickly to stop. Attila is remembered as one of those forces, not because he was supernatural, but because he arrived at exactly the wrong moment for the world he faced. This is the enduring lesson of his life, that the most dangerous threats are not always the strongest. They are the ones that appear when confidence has replaced adaptability, when delay has become habit, when belief in stability has outpaced reality. Attila did not invent fear as policy. He revealed its effectiveness. Europe learned from him, and it paid the price for centuries, because fear can protect, but it can never build, and that tension between survival and stability would define the world long after Attila's name had faded from living memory. The year was 453 CE. Attila the Hun was dead, yet the tremors of his existence shook Europe for generations. His empire dissolved almost instantly. The Huns, a people held together only by fear and obedience, scattered in chaos. His sons claimed authority, but loyalty had always been conditional. The subject peoples who had marched and fought at his command rebelled. The unity he had forged through terror vanished like smoke in the wind. Europe breathed a collective sigh of relief, but that relief was fragile, and it came at an unimaginable cost. Cities had been leveled, fields burned, roads clogged with the dead and the fleeing. Rome had survived, yet the Western Empire was hollow, its authority fractured, its resources exhausted, its armies depleted. Survival had been purchased with blood, panic, and impossible decisions. Attila's death did not end his influence. The fear he had instilled became a force of its own. Chroniclers repeated his deeds, adding horror upon horror, not merely to entertain but to warn. Priests and kings alike invoked his name, a spectre that haunted policy, diplomacy, and warfare. Even centuries later, when new armies swept into Europe, the press of cavalry and the arrow-filled skies brought his shadow back to mind. Historians, poets, and generals all agreed on one truth. Attila was not just a man, he was a paradigm of disruption, an embodiment of the fragility of civilization itself. Attila did not conquer Rome, he never ruled Italy. He never established an empire with codified laws, roads, or monuments. His victories were ephemeral, yet they reshaped the world. Rome's inability to respond rapidly, the slow machinations of its bureaucracy, the politics that delayed action, all of these were laid bare by the arrival of a single man with speed, precision, and the willingness to act decisively. He revealed the weakness beneath the grandeur, the fragility behind the walls, and the illusions that had allowed empires to feel eternal. Every siege he conducted, every city that surrendered, every battle fought on his terms became evidence that even the mightiest civilization could be unbalanced by momentum and fear. Europe rebuilt, but it was a continent changed. Kings learned to value speed over tradition, presence over distance. Castles rose on hills, not only as fortifications, but as instruments of psychological warfare, projecting the threat of swift retaliation. Armies were maintained with vigilance, diplomacy was shadowed with distrust, and political alliances became exercises in constant readiness. The memory of Attila transformed strategy, turning terror into a tool rather than a consequence. Warfare became shorter, sharper, more decisive. Negotiation was informed by fear of sudden disaster, not hope of compromise. Institutions adapted, not because they had understood the lesson of the Huns, but because survival demanded it. Yet the cost was profound. Europe became resilient, but brittle. The reliance on fear and immediacy corroded patience, cooperation, and creativity. Power became localized and fragmented. Large empires were feared as much as they were respected. Authority was personal, contingent, and perpetually at risk of collapse. History teaches that patterns, not personalities, define the endurance of civilizations. Attila was not immortal, but the system he exposed was flawed. The same vulnerabilities that allowed a single man to terrorize Europe remained for centuries, waiting for conditions, timing, and leadership to align once more. Even as Europe rebuilt its cities and markets, restored its trade networks, and strengthened its borders, the psychological scar remained. Fear became policy. Mercenary loyalty was scrutinized. Tributes were paid, not from generosity, but from calculation. Leaders governed with an awareness that the next Attila might appear at any moment, that the world could shift in a single season, that delay or indecision could be fatal. The name Attila became shorthand for unstoppable force, for the moment when human systems reach their limits, when civilization itself is exposed. Attila's legacy was paradoxical. He did not leave institutions, but he influenced governance. He did not conquer permanently, but he shaped the strategies of survival. He did not rule Europe, yet his presence dictated the decisions of rulers for generations. His true power lay in his understanding of fear and the fragility of order, a combination that allowed a single man to move faster than empires could react. He revealed that victory is not measured only by territory or titles, but by the ability to exploit timing, momentum, and the human instinct to panic. And this is why Attila remains a figure of fascination. He is a reminder that history is not always driven by morality, ideology, or even numbers. Sometimes it is driven by speed, decisiveness, and the courage to act when others hesitate. He showed that empires fall not solely from force, but from the inability to respond rapidly and intelligently to disruption. His story endures because it transcends the Huns, transcends Rome, and speaks to the timeless vulnerability of any complex system. Attila the Hun is remembered as a destroyer, yet his destruction was selective. He did not obliterate civilization, he exposed its fragility. He forced Europe to confront its limitations, to rethink strategy, and to understand that permanence is an illusion. The Huns are gone, Rome is gone, yet the shadow he cast persisted. His name became synonymous with unstoppable power, a symbol invoked whenever speed, ruthlessness, and timing conspired to overcome stability. He did not need to conquer to change the world. He only needed to arrive at the right moment, to act decisively, and to understand the fear that lay dormant within every human system. And for this, Attila remains unforgettable, a cautionary figure whose story resonates beyond the battlefield, beyond empires, and into the heart of human vulnerability itself. His life is a warning, his death a reminder, and his legacy a testament to the enduring impact of one man who understood how fragile the world truly was. The year was 450 CE. Europe had survived the storms of Attila's campaigns, yet it was forever altered. His armies had retreated, but the terror he left in his wake was permanent. Cities no longer believed walls could save them. Armies understood that numbers were meaningless without speed and decisive command. Leaders realized that authority depended not just on law and tradition, but on the ability to act before disaster struck. The Western Roman Empire had survived physically, but psychologically it had been shattered. Its citizens and rulers alike carried a profound awareness that their world could vanish in a single season. The Huns had revealed a vulnerability that Rome had long ignored, and that awareness shaped the future of the continent. Attila's approach had been unlike anything Europe had ever seen. He did not rely on fortifications, siege engines, or elaborate logistics. His power came from mobility, unpredictability, and the ruthless application of fear. Armies moved ahead of armies, raiding, pillaging, and terrorizing before opponents could react. Cities surrendered at his approach, not always because they had been defeated, but because the mere threat of his presence made resistance seem futile. By every known rule of warfare, he should have been stopped, yet he struck precisely when hesitation became deadly. His genius lay in understanding human psychology, in recognizing that the mind could be conquered as decisively as the body. After his death in 453 CE, Europe attempted to rebuild, but the lesson of Attila had embedded itself deeply. Successor kingdoms learned that survival demanded constant vigilance. The Frankish kings, the Ostrogoths, the Lombards, all adapted to a world in which sudden destruction was always possible. Castles became not only defensive structures but symbols of immediate power. Lords punished rebellions swiftly to prevent panic from spreading. Armies were maintained at readiness, not merely for war but for the psychological advantage of constant deterrence. Attila had demonstrated that fear, when applied deliberately, could accomplish what armies often could not. Yet the Europeans misinterpreted the lesson at first. They assumed that replication of brutality would yield the same results. They fortified frontiers against Huns and nomads, but the real threat was never simply an army. It was the speed of decision and the capacity to destabilize systems faster than they could react. Attila's true impact lay in exposing structural weaknesses. Rome had survived previous invasions because of its institutions, its bureaucracy, and the inertia of habit. Attila arrived when that inertia had become a liability. His invasions revealed the fragility of empires that depended on the assumption of continuity. Civilization could crumble not because it was weak, but because it was slow. In the decades following his campaigns, Europe adjusted. Leaders moved closer to their armies. Governance became more personal and immediate. Local authorities gained power to act decisively in moments of crisis. Laws evolved to allow rapid enforcement. Diplomacy was shadowed with suspicion. Trust narrowed to family, allies, and those whose loyalty was immediate and observable. Centralized power was feared as much as it was respected, because concentration of authority could be paralyzed by indecision. Attila had taught a generation that certainty was a liability, and this lesson influenced strategy, governance, and society for centuries. The memory of Attila extended beyond military tactics. He became a psychological standard, a benchmark for crisis. Writers described his approach as divine punishment, a scourge sent to punish arrogance and complacency. In Germanic epics he appeared as Etzel, an imposing and almost supernatural figure. In Christian thought, he was an instrument of God's wrath, terrifying and unstoppable. Even as time passed, his legend was invoked to ensure compliance, to instill caution, to warn rulers of the consequences of overconfidence. Attila had entered collective memory not as a conqueror who ruled lands, but as a force that tested the limits of human systems. Europe's reaction to Attila's campaigns revealed another lesson: civilizations do not collapse from external forces alone. Collapse occurs when internal assumptions fail, when institutions cannot match the pace of threats, and when leadership hesitates. Attila's brilliance lay not in his cruelty, but in his timing and understanding of momentum. His invasions were less about the destruction of cities than about exposing weaknesses. He did not seek to rebuild what he conquered. His objective was psychological, a relentless pressure that forced empires to reveal their fragility. The fear he instilled was both his weapon and his legacy, a model that reshaped European thinking about power, defense, and governance. Even in death, Attila's influence persisted. Europe measured itself against him for generations. When new invaders appeared, from Mongols to later nomadic incursions, chroniclers immediately called them New Huns, reflecting the deep imprint he had left. The lesson was clear: a civilization's true vulnerability is often invisible, revealed only under pressure. Attila had revealed it, and Europe could never forget. Every castle built, every army trained, every policy enforced with urgency traced its lineage back to the shock of his campaigns. He demonstrated that the speed of action, understanding of fear, and ability to exploit hesitation were more decisive than size, wealth, or fortification. The story of Attila the Hun endures because it is not only about the Huns or Rome, but about the mechanics of power itself. His life is a study in the use of psychological insight as strategy. It is a warning that even the mightiest empires are fragile when they are slow, complacent, or overconfident. The Huns vanished, but their effect on Europe was permanent. Leaders, armies, and societies adapted in response, reshaping governance, warfare, and diplomacy. Fear became institutionalized. Momentum became decisive. And Europe would never again assume that safety was guaranteed, that power was absolute, or that history moved predictably. Attila did not need to rule long or leave monuments. His genius was in revealing a truth more terrifying than conquest: that human systems can collapse silently, swiftly, and decisively when confronted with clarity, speed, and relentless pressure. The Huns faded, Rome faded, yet the shadow he cast remained, guiding, warning, and haunting every generation that faced uncertainty. Every leader that hesitated too long remembered the lesson he left, that a single force, understanding how to move faster than the world expects, can unsettle civilizations and leave echoes of fear that last for centuries. The year was 451 CE, and Europe had never felt such terror before. Attila the Hun advanced through Gaul with an army of unprecedented mobility, striking fear into the hearts of every city, every garrison, and every ruler. His forces were outnumbered in some battles, yet the outcomes favored him because he understood the dynamics of fear, speed, and unpredictability in ways that no Roman general had anticipated. Entire populations fled at the mere rumor of his approach, leaving towns deserted and fields untended. His presence was both psychological and physical, a combination that allowed him to dominate landscapes without the conventional tools of conquest. Empires had walls and legions, yet they were fragile against an enemy who acted faster than their expectations. Attila did not merely fight armies. He disrupted minds, destabilized command, and forced hesitation to become defeat. The Battle of the Catalonian Plains illustrates this with brutal clarity. Roman forces and Visigothic allies faced the Huns in one of the largest confrontations of the era. By every known rule of warfare, the Romans had numerical advantage, better fortifications, and established supply lines. Yet the Huns' relentless pressure, cavalry maneuvering with terrifying precision, and the shock of their initial assault sowed panic in allied ranks. Even when the Romans counterattacked, they faced a foe who adapted instantly to changes on the battlefield. Leaders hesitated, soldiers faltered, and momentum became a weapon that worked more effectively than any spear or sword. Historians insist the battle should have ended in Roman victory, yet the Huns survived and withdrew on their terms, proving that speed, decisiveness, and fear can outweigh numbers and preparation. Attila's campaigns reshaped strategy across Europe. Cities that had once relied on walls and garrisons now built with psychological impact in mind, positioning fortifications to intimidate as much as defend, armies trained for rapid deployment and constant readiness, aware that a delay of even a single day could prove catastrophic. Diplomacy became increasingly preemptive, alliances forged not from trust but from calculation and immediate necessity. Leaders learned to govern closer to their forces, to act swiftly, and to anticipate disruption rather than react to it. Attila had taught Europe that the consequences of underestimating an opponent could be total annihilation, and this lesson embedded itself into governance and warfare for centuries. Yet the true genius of Attila was never in conquest alone. He exploited the structural weaknesses of the Roman world with precision. Rome had long depended on tradition, bureaucracy, and slow, methodical decision-making. Attila attacked exactly when those systems were least able to respond, when overconfidence had lulled leaders into complacency. He demonstrated that speed of decision and clarity of intent were often more decisive than superior numbers or technology. Every siege, every raid, every diplomatic encounter was designed to expose weakness and exploit it before it could be corrected. He did not merely conquer territories, he revealed the fragility of civilization itself, and in doing so, he redefined what it meant to wage war. The psychological impact of his campaigns cannot be overstated. Cities surrendered without combat, armies dissolved in panic, tributes were paid in advance to avoid devastation. Rulers made concessions not out of respect, but from an understanding that hesitation could be fatal. Fear became a strategic asset, a tool for control, and a force that shaped European politics for generations. Attila demonstrated that a single individual, acting with understanding, decisiveness, and speed, could bend empires to his will without establishing a lasting state. He moved like a shadow across the continent, leaving ruin in his wake and forcing societies to adapt or collapse. Even after his death in 453 CE, the lessons of Attila endured. The Hunnic Empire collapsed because it depended entirely on his leadership. His sons could not maintain cohesion, yet Europe remembered the fear he had imposed. Leaders studied his campaigns. Chroniclers wrote of his ruthlessness, and every sudden threat was measured against the standard he had set. Fortifications, armies, and political structures evolved to account for the possibility that momentum and decisiveness could outpace established order. Attila had not built an empire to last. He had built an example that would shape centuries of military and political thought. Europe's rulers internalized this lesson, Speed became valued over size, mobility over fortification, presence over distance. Armies were maintained to respond immediately rather than march slowly according to tradition. Castles became instruments of psychological projection. Leaders punished rebellion swiftly to prevent panic from spreading. Diplomacy became shadowed with calculation and contingency plans. Attila's impact was as much about mindset as it was about territory. He transformed the concept of power from a function of force alone to a combination of timing, fear, and decisiveness. Attila's enduring relevance lies not in the lands he conquered, which were temporary, but in the principles he revealed. He showed that civilizations fail not only when they are weaker, but when they move slower than the threats they face. He revealed that fear, when wielded intelligently, could be more effective than armies. He exposed the vulnerability of systems that assume continuity, and he demonstrated that momentum and clarity of purpose can topple even the mightiest empires. His campaigns became a reference point for generations, a model for understanding how disruption can be leveraged for advantage, and a warning that complacency is fatal. The shadow of Attila stretched far beyond his death. It shaped medieval Europe, influenced military strategy, and entered the collective consciousness as a symbol of unstoppable force. He did not need to rule for centuries or construct cities to leave a mark. His genius was in revealing what could collapse under pressure and how quickly the world could change when leadership hesitated. The Huns faded, Rome fell, yet the lessons he imposed endured. Fear became a tool, decisiveness a necessity, and the ability to act before disaster struck the defining quality of survival. Attila the Hun remains unforgettable, not because of the empire he built, but because of the systems he exposed, the fears he awakened, and the enduring principle that momentum and clarity can overpower tradition, numbers, and even the illusions of permanence. The year was 452 CE. Attila had marched into Italy, leaving behind a trail of destruction that would haunt the continent for generations. Cities trembled at the sound of approaching cavalry. Walls once thought impenetrable seemed fragile, and leaders found themselves paralyzed by the speed and decisiveness of the Hun. Rome was not yet conquered, yet the psychological blow was more devastating than any physical assault. Populations fled, armies hesitated, and entire regions emptied in panic. Attila's presence forced the understanding that power could shift faster than tradition could respond, that civilizations could unravel not through weakness alone, but through the inability to act swiftly under pressure. This lesson reshaped Europe in ways no historian could have predicted, embedding fear into governance, strategy, and collective memory. Attila's genius lay in his ability to combine mobility, strategy, and psychological insight. He understood that human systems are often slower than the threats they face. Rome relied on communication, bureaucracy, and hierarchy. Attila relied on speed, surprise, and decisiveness. Where the Romans delayed, he advanced. Where they fortified, he bypassed. Where they hesitated, he struck. By every conventional standard of warfare, he should have failed. His armies were sometimes outnumbered, his resources stretched, and his logistics imperfect. Yet he triumphed because he acted faster than his enemies could react, exploiting hesitation and magnifying the impact of fear. His campaigns were lessons in momentum, demonstrating that the psychological impact of an approaching threat could be as decisive as any weapon. The devastation wrought across Italy was calculated. Attila did not need to conquer every city to assert dominance. He understood that terror could achieve obedience where armies could not. Cities paid tribute to avoid destruction, leaders negotiated under duress, and entire regions submitted without a fight. His approach was efficient, ruthless, and terrifyingly effective. He forced Europe to recognize that safety was an illusion, that walls and armies were insufficient when fear moved faster than defense. This awareness shaped military doctrine, leading to the construction of fortifications designed not only to repel attackers, but to project strength and deter aggression. Armies trained for rapid response and constant readiness, and rulers governed closer to their forces, aware that delay could be fatal. Even after his death in 453 CE, Attila's impact did not diminish. The Hunnic Empire fragmented because it depended entirely on his leadership, yet Europe continued to operate under the lessons he had imposed. Chroniclers and historians remembered his campaigns with horror and fascination. His name became a reference point for sudden disaster, unstoppable momentum, and the consequences of indecision. Military leaders studied his tactics, rulers adopted policies informed by fear, and societies internalized the understanding that survival demanded speed, decisiveness, and the anticipation of disruption. Attila had demonstrated that civilization is fragile, and this knowledge was passed from generation to generation. Europe's political landscape transformed as a result. Trust became conditional, alliances were forged with contingency plans, and diplomacy was shadowed by suspicion. Leaders valued presence over distance, personal command over delegated authority, and rapid enforcement over deliberation. The European world became a continent braced for shock, constantly aware that a single decision, or lack thereof, could trigger disaster. Attila's campaigns had revealed not only military weaknesses but systemic vulnerabilities, and rulers sought to address these vulnerabilities by building resilience into both governance and strategy. Fear, once an emotional response, became an instrument of statecraft, shaping policy, warfare, and diplomacy. The psychological dimension of Attila's legacy cannot be overstated. His ability to manipulate perception, to make small forces appear unstoppable, and to create terror that traveled faster than armies, set a precedent that would influence European warfare for centuries. Leaders internalized the notion that appearances and timing could be as powerful as strength and numbers. Cities and armies adapted not only physically but mentally, preparing for the worst and expecting disruption. Attila's campaigns became a benchmark for how rapidly circumstances could change, demonstrating that momentum, decisiveness, and psychological pressure could dictate outcomes far more effectively than conventional measures of power. Even beyond the battlefield, Attila shaped memory and culture. Chroniclers depicted him as a scourge of God, an almost mythic figure whose wrath punished human arrogance. Poets and historians amplified his cruelty to illustrate moral lessons, yet beneath the exaggeration lay a practical truth. Attila revealed the vulnerabilities of complex systems, the fragility of civilizations that relied on stability, and the consequences of underestimating speed and decisiveness. His campaigns became templates for understanding how power operates under stress, how fear can be leveraged as strategy, and how timing can overturn assumptions about security. The Huns may have vanished, and Rome would eventually collapse, but the shadow of Attila endured. His example influenced military strategy, governance, and societal norms for centuries. The awareness he imposed, that systems can fail when they move too slowly, that leadership requires both decisiveness and adaptability, that fear can be weaponized, remained central to European consciousness. Fortifications, armies, and political structures evolved with his lessons in mind, and leaders measured threats against the standard he had set. Attila's genius lay not in conquest alone, but in revealing the mechanisms of collapse, showing that a civilization's vulnerability is often invisible until it is too late. The lasting lesson of Attila the Hun is profound. He teaches that power is not only a matter of size or resources, but of timing, speed, and psychological insight. He demonstrated that civilizations fall not solely from external attacks, but from their inability to adapt rapidly. Momentum can defeat numbers, decisiveness can outweigh tradition, and fear, when wielded with understanding, can reshape the destiny of nations. Attila's campaigns reveal the fragility of order, the dangers of complacency, and the enduring impact of a leader who understands how to exploit the weaknesses of human systems. His life and legacy remain a warning, a study of the mechanics of fear, and a testament to the principle that one man, acting with clarity and speed, can alter the course of history forever. The year was 450 CE, and Europe had already learned the first lesson of the Huns. Fear could be more powerful than armies. Attila had shown that the mind could be conquered as decisively as the body. Cities surrendered at the rumor of his approach, and populations fled before a single arrow was loosed. His campaigns were not only tactical but psychological, exploiting hesitation, magnifying panic, and transforming rumor into reality. By understanding human perception, he amplified the effect of his comparatively small forces, demonstrating that momentum, timing, and reputation could achieve what brute force alone could not. Every encounter reinforced the lesson that civilization is vulnerable not only to strength but to anticipation and morale. Attila's understanding of psychology was ruthless and deliberate. He recognized that commanders constrained by protocol, bureaucracy, or expectation would hesitate when faced with an unpredictable threat. He leveraged that hesitation to his advantage. Retreats were not always forced by combat, but by fear. Walls could be bypassed, not by siege engines, but by the terror his reputation instilled. Even the most disciplined armies faltered when confronted by a force whose actions defied the assumptions of conventional warfare. Attila turned perception into strategy, showing that the fear of destruction could be weaponized to create surrender without bloodshed, and when violence was necessary, it became overwhelming because it arrived faster than thought could respond. The implications of this approach reshaped Europe for generations. Kings and lords internalized the understanding that perception could be as decisive as action. Armies were reorganized to respond immediately. Fortifications became psychological as well as physical instruments, and governance itself adapted to accommodate rapid response. Leaders governed from the front, traveling with their forces to ensure control and reaction. The medieval world, shaped by these lessons, valued speed, adaptability, and anticipation over traditional measures of power. Attila's campaigns became case studies not only in warfare but in the vulnerabilities of human systems. Even in death, Attila's influence endured. The Huns disbanded without his leadership, yet the memory of their effectiveness persisted in chronicles, stories, and cultural memory. Historians and leaders used his campaigns as warnings, emphasizing the consequences of complacency and delay. Fear became institutionalized, and Europe learned that survival depended on acting before catastrophe struck. This was not only a lesson in military strategy, but in governance, law, and diplomacy. Alliances were maintained with contingencies in mind, treaties enforced with urgency, and local authorities empowered to respond immediately. The shadow of Attila had redefined what it meant to exercise power. The psychological impact of his campaigns also affected civilian populations. Communities prepared for sudden attacks, fortified settlements, and conducted surveillance. The awareness that destruction could arrive at any moment shaped culture and social organization. Fear became embedded into the rhythms of daily life, not as panic but as preparedness. Leaders and subjects alike understood that stability was never guaranteed and that the capacity to react with speed and decisiveness determined survival. Attila had imposed a lesson that transcended military engagement, shaping behavior, policy, and the mental framework of entire societies. Attila's genius lay in revealing systemic vulnerabilities. He exposed the limits of bureaucracy, the fragility of delayed decision-making, and the dangers of overconfidence. Rome had survived many invasions because of its procedural strength, but when confronted with speed, decisiveness, and fear applied with precision, the system faltered. By acting faster than the expectations of his enemies, Attila turned conventional strategies upside down. He demonstrated that momentum and perception could outweigh numbers and fortification. The psychological dimension of his campaigns forced Europe to rethink strategy, not just on the battlefield but in governance and diplomacy as well. The memory of Attila shaped leadership models for centuries. Kings traveled with their armies, prioritized rapid communication, and maintained constant readiness. Diplomatic agreements were negotiated with contingencies, and local authorities were empowered to act decisively. Fortifications projected strength and deterrence more than protection. Armies trained for rapid deployment, anticipating surprise attacks. Fear, once considered a byproduct of war, became an instrument, a strategic tool to influence enemies before combat began. The shadow of Attila transformed Europe's understanding of power, demonstrating that leadership required both psychological insight and operational agility. The enduring relevance of Attila lies in the universality of the principles he revealed. Civilizations continue to fail, not only because of external threats, but because their internal systems cannot respond rapidly enough. Leadership is tested not by the absence of danger, but by the capacity to act decisively under pressure. Momentum and clarity, the lessons of the Huns, remain critical in understanding both historical and contemporary vulnerabilities. Attila's campaigns illustrate that fear, timing and perception can overwhelm institutions, and that human systems are only as resilient as their ability to adapt to unexpected forces. Attila the Hun did not merely conquer territories, he exposed the fundamental fragility of order. He forced societies to confront the uncomfortable truth that stability is never guaranteed. The Huns faded, Rome eventually fell, yet the lessons he imposed endured. Fear became a tool, decisiveness a necessity, and rapid response the defining characteristic of survival. Attila's life and campaigns offer a timeless warning that the most devastating threats are those that exploit hesitation, that momentum can outpace size and preparation, and that the ability to act before disaster is often the difference between survival and collapse. The year was 452 CE, and Attila's shadow stretched across Europe long after his departure from Italy. Cities were scarred, economies disrupted, populations displaced, yet the psychological impact of his campaigns was more profound than the physical destruction. He had demonstrated a truth that would haunt rulers for generations. Empires are fragile, not because of external enemies alone, but because their internal systems are too slow, too rigid, and too dependent on assumptions of continuity. Rome had survived centuries through bureaucracy, tradition, and sheer inertia, yet when confronted with a force that understood speed, decisiveness, and the exploitation of fear, even the mightiest institutions faltered. Attila's genius was in revealing this fragility, in demonstrating that the survival of civilizations depends on their capacity to respond faster than disruption arrives. His campaigns were lessons in momentum and perception. Where conventional armies relied on preparation and numbers, Attila relied on timing, mobility, and psychological pressure. He attacked before his enemies could consolidate, forced leaders into decisions under extreme duress, and magnified panic in populations already conditioned to fear chaos. Cities surrendered at the mere rumor of his approach, armies dissolved in hesitation, and tribute was paid not out of respect but from the understanding that resistance meant annihilation. By manipulating perception and exploiting uncertainty, Attila achieved victories that far exceeded the strength of his forces. This strategic application of terror reshaped warfare and governance alike. Even after his death, the consequences of his campaigns continued to shape European politics. The Hunnic Empire collapsed because its cohesion depended entirely on Attila's leadership, yet the memory of his methods endured. European rulers internalized the lessons of speed, decisiveness, and psychological impact. Fortifications were built to project power as much as to defend. Armies were maintained for immediate response rather than prolonged campaigns. Diplomatic agreements were shadowed with contingency plans and suspicion. Governance became more personal and immediate, with leaders traveling alongside forces to ensure rapid decision-making. Fear, once an emotional response, became a strategic instrument, embedding itself into the structure of medieval Europe. Attila's campaigns also transformed cultural memory. Chroniclers described him as a scourge, a force of divine wrath, an almost supernatural presence, yet beneath the exaggeration lay practical lessons. He had revealed vulnerabilities in complex systems, shown the danger of overconfidence, and demonstrated the consequences of hesitation. His name became synonymous with unstoppable momentum, a standard against which subsequent threats were measured. Even centuries later, new invasions were described as the coming of a new Attila, illustrating the enduring psychological imprint he left. Attila became both a historical figure and a principle, a symbol of the speed, decisiveness and fear necessary to overcome stability. The broader lesson of Attila's life is the fragility of human systems. Civilizations are often tested not by raw force, but by the inability to respond to disruption with speed and clarity. Leadership is tested not by routine management, but by the capacity to act decisively under pressure. Attila demonstrated that momentum and psychological insight could outweigh numbers, fortifications and tradition. His campaigns revealed that order is never guaranteed, and that even the mightiest empires can be destabilized if they cannot adapt rapidly to unforeseen challenges. This lesson resonates far beyond the 5th century, offering insight into how power, governance and strategy operate in any era. Europe's response to Attila illustrates the enduring impact of his campaigns. Leaders became more vigilant, armies more mobile, fortifications more intimidating, and governance more immediate. Fear was institutionalized. Decisions were accelerated, policies were implemented with awareness of potential disruption. The continent's strategies, politics and military doctrines evolved not because of ideology, but because survival demanded adaptation. Attila's genius lay in exploiting weakness, yet it was the response to his campaigns that reshaped Europe permanently. His life and methods became the template for understanding how systems succeed or fail under pressure. Even in death, Attila's influence was evident. He did not leave an empire, but he left a paradigm. Europe measured threats against the standard he had established: momentum, speed, decisiveness and fear as a tool. Fortifications, armies and alliances were designed with these principles in mind. Leadership was redefined to include rapid response and psychological acuity. Attila's legacy endures because it demonstrates that the collapse of civilizations is often less about the strength of enemies and more about the inability of systems to respond to sudden decisive force. His campaigns remain a reference for understanding the mechanisms of disruption and the principles of survival under extreme pressure. The enduring relevance of Attila the Hun lies in the universality of his insight. Civilizations fail not only because of external threats, but because internal processes move slower than danger arrives. He revealed that decisiveness and momentum can overturn expectations, that fear can be harnessed as strategy, and that perception often dictates outcomes as much as force. The Huns faded, Rome eventually collapsed, yet the structural lessons of his campaigns endured. Leaders, armies and societies internalized the principle that speed, clarity and psychological pressure could define the survival of states and empires. Attila's life is a case study in the fragility of order, the consequences of delay and the enduring impact of one man who understood how to exploit the weaknesses of civilization itself. Attila did not need to establish a lasting empire to alter the course of history. His victories were temporary, yet their influence was permanent. By moving faster than Europe expected, by acting decisively when hesitation ruled, and by using fear as a tool rather than a byproduct, he rewrote the rules of survival and power. His campaigns reshaped military strategy, governance, diplomacy, and cultural memory. The Huns disappeared, Rome fell, yet the shadow he cast endured across centuries. The story of Attila the Hun remains a testament to the principle that a single individual, armed with understanding, decisiveness and timing, can expose the vulnerabilities of even the mightiest systems and leave an imprint that outlasts armies, empires and generations. The year was 453 CE, and Attila the Hun lay dead, yet Europe remained gripped by the memory of his relentless campaigns. His death did not erase the terror he had imposed, nor did it undo the psychological and structural transformations he had forced upon the continent. Cities that had once trembled at his approach now rebuilt their walls with greater height, their gates reinforced, and their garrisons trained for immediate action. Armies were maintained, not only to defend territory, but to project rapid response, anticipating threats that could strike without warning. Diplomacy, long a matter of ritual and negotiation, became a game of preemption and contingency. Leaders understood that hesitation could be fatal, and that momentum, speed and decisiveness had become the most vital currencies of power. Attila's life and death had revealed the fragile architecture of civilizations and taught Europe that survival demanded constant vigilance. Attila had never sought to construct an empire in the conventional sense. He did not establish cities, codify laws, or leave a bureaucracy to endure beyond his presence. Yet the world he left behind was profoundly altered. His genius lay in understanding that the true power of an empire was not in its size, wealth, or fortifications, but in its capacity to respond swiftly to disruption. He exploited systemic weaknesses, targeting not only armies and cities, but the structures of decision-making themselves. The Huns moved faster than any messenger, struck where hesitation lingered, and magnified panic to the point of surrender. Rome survived his campaigns physically, but psychologically it had been shattered, its leaders forever aware that stability is only as strong as the speed with which it can react. Europe adapted in response. Fortifications were redesigned to intimidate as well as defend, projecting strength to deter aggression before it could begin. Armies were organized for rapid deployment, with command structures streamlined to enable immediate action. Kings and nobles traveled with their forces to ensure that decisions could be made at the front, understanding that delays in communication could mean disaster. Tributes and alliances were negotiated with contingency plans, and rebellion was punished swiftly to prevent panic from spreading. Governance became a matter of presence, speed, and psychological leverage, reflecting the enduring lesson that authority must act decisively to survive in a world shaped by the shadow of Attila. The cultural memory of Attila reinforced his influence. Chroniclers portrayed him as a scourge of God, a figure larger than life, whose ruthlessness was legendary. Yet beneath the myth lay a practical understanding. He revealed the vulnerabilities of human systems, exposed the dangers of overconfidence, and demonstrated that momentum, timing, and psychological insight could outweigh numbers and fortifications. His campaigns became a benchmark for rulers and armies, a standard against which all sudden threats were measured. Attila became a principle as much as a person, a lesson that no civilization could ignore. Fear, once a reaction, had become a tool, and speed, decisiveness, and perception were recognized as essential to survival. Attila's influence shaped European strategy for centuries. Successor kingdoms reorganized their armies, reformed their governance, and reconsidered the role of fear in maintaining control. Leaders internalized the principle that survival depended not only on strength, but on the ability to act before disaster arrived. Fortresses were designed to project power and deter aggression, not merely to withstand sieges. Armies were trained for mobility and readiness, and alliances were evaluated based on the capacity for rapid coordination. The lessons of the Huns extended beyond warfare into the organization of society itself, shaping the way Europe prepared for and responded to sudden threats. Even the collapse of the Hunnic Empire could not diminish Attila's legacy. His sons failed to maintain cohesion, and the tribes dispersed, but the psychological imprint he left endured. The fear he instilled, the structural weaknesses he exposed, and the principles of speed, decisiveness, and psychological pressure became embedded in European consciousness. Historians, chroniclers, and military theorists repeated his campaigns as cautionary tales, ensuring that the lessons would not fade with the passing of time. Every empire, every army, and every leader who confronted unexpected threats would recall the name Attila and the standard he set for what unstoppable force could achieve. Attila teaches a timeless lesson about the fragility of human systems. Civilizations collapse, not only because of enemies, but because they move too slowly, hesitate too long, or underestimate the impact of momentum and psychological pressure. His campaigns reveal that fear can be weaponized, perception can dictate outcomes, and decisive action can overcome seemingly insurmountable odds. Even without leaving an enduring empire, Attila reshaped the future of Europe, leaving behind a paradigm in which speed, decisiveness, and the strategic use of fear define power and survival. Europe emerged from his campaigns more resilient, but also more brittle. Leaders acted with immediacy, armies moved with urgency, and societies learned to anticipate disruption. The memory of Attila became a permanent element of strategy and governance. His life demonstrated that a single individual, acting with understanding, speed and decisiveness, could exploit the vulnerabilities of empires and alter the course of history. The Huns vanished, Rome fell, but the lessons of Attila's campaigns endured across centuries, shaping the very principles of power and survival. Attila the Hun remains unforgettable, not because of what he built, but because of what he revealed. He showed that empires are fragile, that momentum can overcome size, that fear can be as decisive as swords, and that decisive action can rewrite the expectations of the world. His campaigns were not merely battles, they were demonstrations of systemic fragility and the consequences of hesitation. Civilizations, armies and leaders would carry his lessons forward, forever aware that speed, clarity and psychological insight are as critical to survival as walls, armies and resources. Attila did not conquer to rule, he conquered to reveal the truth about human systems, leaving a legacy that would outlast his people and echo through the annals of history, a reminder that the balance of power is never secure and that a single unstoppable force can change the world forever.